As I got another rhyme, another rhythm for y'all to listen. I'm never quitting on my mission, I'ma roll with what I'm giving. Got some ambition, this new edition, filling positions. Looking at the void in myself and feeling what's missing. Better watch the way you going, better go in the right direction. In the moment you stressing, but you gon' be counting blessings. And I know that for certain, keep on working, open curtains. Haters swerving, cause they ain't ready for your final version. Whoa. I'm never gonna give up, fall down, I just gotta get up, yeah. Cause this is my road, let's camera action, I'm ready to go.
You're listening to the Tom Ficklin Show on WNHH LP 103.5 FM, your home for community radio.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. And it's a good morning today here in the East Coast in New Haven on Monday, November 7th. It's also tomorrow in Australia. So I mention that because some of our shows, if I can just express my hubris, are indeed timeless. And the show today, when you listen to it either live or after the fact, we're going to talk about facts. We're going to talk about some theory, but also some applications. But the point I'm trying to make is we're going to discuss the human condition from a contemporary standpoint, from a therapeutic standpoint, but also all of my shows are based and embedded in this human condition framework of how do we improve ourselves, become a better species, become better humans. Specifically, today's shows are going to be focusing on literally groundbreaking discoveries in the treatment of psychiatric disorders. Let me repeat that: groundbreaking discoveries in the treatment of psychiatric disorders. And this is not to say that I'm going to be used as an example of a person with the psychiatric disorders, but by the end of the show, you might find that I'm a candidate for ketamine. So groundbreaking discoveries in the treatment of psychiatric disorders. It's said that a certain person who's on the show today, Dr. John Krystal, said, often one groundbreaking discovery leads to others. And these are the words of Dr. John Krystal. I won't say he's a Moses, but in terms of the discovery, the application, the research, the potential of this new therapeutic intervention, folks, this is a very historic and herstory show. Dr. Krystal is with us. Dr. Krystal is chair of the Department of Psychiatry at Yale University and chief of psychiatry and behavioral health at Yale New Haven Hospital. We're joined by Reverend Dr. Leroy O. Perry Jr. Reverend Perry, I had a chance to meet several decades ago, and in our youth, we're concerned with what does it mean to kind of be a whole and a sound and a prosperous individual. When we were at the Yale Divinity School, and Dr. Perry has continued on that path about how do we improve the human condition? How do we improve the human condition? Dr. Perry is pastor of St. Stephen's AME Zion Church and cultural ambassador to the Yale Clinical Research Program. Reverend Perry and Dr. Krystal, welcome.
Thank you. Wonderful to be here.
Thank you, Tom.
And just to kind of just share just a little bit before we kind of put Dr. Krystal on the hot seat, but I'm sure he can handle it. He's chair of the Department of the Psychiatry at Yale University and chief of psychiatry and behavioral health, as I mentioned, of New Haven Hospital, and a leading expert, not only in the areas of, and folks kind of, the words I'm going to mention, we hear these words timing, but what does it mean to be a leading expert in the areas of alcoholism, post-traumatic stress disorder, schizophrenia, and depression research? So that's a lot, but he has deserved those titles, has worked in the vineyard, and he has a lot to share. So Dr. Krystal, welcome. And, as a sidebar, maybe kind of people might be interested why I start off with this question, but I think they'll find your answer to be illuminating about, tell us a little bit about your father's story and how that has impacted your work in the field of psychiatry.
Sure. Well, my father was a psychiatrist, Henry Krystal, who was a real inspiration to me in all kinds of ways in my life. He was born in Poland, and he was Jewish, taken by the Nazis when he was about 13, and after a while sent to the death camps like Auschwitz. By the time he was 15 or 16 years old, he was the only surviving member of his family. By then, all of the other members of his family, parents, brother, had been killed. And after the war, came to the United States with nothing, and lived in the basement of the general store that his aunt, who had moved to America, had set up in Detroit, Michigan, where I also grew up. And he managed to get a scholarship to college and then to medical school, and he pursued a career in psychiatry. And his area of special expertise was in treating the psychological consequences of surviving the Holocaust, the treating the concentration camp survivors, and that was in the 1950s and 1960s, before we had a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. So in working with the concentration camp survivors, he and others laid the foundation for how we in our country dealt with the returning Vietnam veterans, whose experience in turn led to the establishment of the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder in 1980. So my father's work was, really an inspiration in so many ways for me and shaped my career.
There are so many stories, Dr. Krystal, about how the impact of and influence of parents, but sometimes the daughters, the sons, they rebel about the influence of their father. It seems to me you followed in the footsteps. What was the cohesion or the attraction to kind of sustain that initiative?
Well, I rebelled in my own way. So my father was a psychoanalyst who focused on the psychological experience of everybody that he was working with. And I thought that as I was studying psychology in college, I thought maybe that would be a direction I might pursue. But when I was a student in college, I became fascinated by the idea that the problems that of the people that I was interacting with at the time I was working in volunteering in clinics for opiate addiction, that the idea that there was an underlying neurobiology that was contributing to the problems that people were having and might be targeted in new ways to yield new treatments, that idea captivated me. And really, once I latched onto that idea, it really became the foundation of my work over the last, that was probably 42 years ago. I've been at this for a while.
And we're going to drill down. We may not get a chance to cover every day of those 40 years, but certainly we're going to chat about because you are indeed deservedly celebrated for leading the discovery of antidepressant effects of ketamine. And before we go to that, Reverend Perry, I want to kind of go maybe off script and share with us, if you would, and I'll talk a little slower to kind of give you a chance to gird your loins, about the impact of either your father, your mother, or people in your life, because I think it's important for people to know that as well, in the same way that Dr. Krystal has shared.
Tom, I'm fascinated, even more so, Dr. Krystal, having heard the story of Auschwitz and your father's survival and success in such a prominent field. When I was a student, I read a book entitled, I think it's Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, who was in a concentration camp, and he tried to tell us how he was able to survive that. And so when I look at post-traumatic stress syndrome, and I look at what African Americans have gone through in the nation before ketamine and before antidepressants, they had, so this combination of faith and science here is remarkable. When I was a student at Yale, Tom and I did Tavistock, and I worked at the Orange Street Alcohol Clinic. But the idea was, what is it that we can help to empower people who suffer from depression, post-traumatic stress syndrome? So with the discoveries that you are making now, I'm just wondering. So one of my questions would be that how do you see the impact of faith or a sense of a person's individual will to survive based on love, based on faith, based on, I mean, it seems like they have to go together. I mean, you can give a person a drug, but if they don't want to live, if they don't, if they don't want to take it, if they're so messed up, it just seems that it doesn't really have the kind of effect that it would have if there's those other components.
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and yeah, I don't know if Reverend Perry, whether you ever met the late Steve Southwick, a psychiatrist here in New Haven, was actually a student of Viktor Frankl's institute, and he developed ideas about the foundations of human resilience and belief in something larger than yourself, and connection to that belief, the power of that connection, he felt was a very important fundamental building block of human resilience. And when I think of my father's story, one of the things that he was saying was that there were times when he was very near death and for example, he was on death marches where they wouldn't feed you and you had to march for long periods of time. And if you dropped, they would just shoot you. And he was in a very extreme state of starvation. And he would talk about how the belief that he mattered to somebody, in his case, he held on to the idea that he was connected to his mother, that he had a strong relationship, and that he knew that she loved him, and that he counted for something, and somehow that belief for him helped him to keep going and instead of giving up. And it's these fundamental beliefs of personal value and connection to something larger than yourself that often is so really extremely meaningful. And to try to make a link to the biology, the way that I've always approached the way that I think about ketamine and antidepressant medications is that they're tools that people use to reinforce their resilience. And so that the medications, to the extent that people, some people need to believe in the medications because they can't believe in anything else. But in a way, if they see that the medications are tools that they're using to help themselves achieve a better life, that sometimes gets past some of the problems that people have with the idea of needing to take a medication in order to get better.
Dr. Krystal, kind of gets to elaborate a little bit more, if you would, in terms of we're still in the early part of the show. We have about 40 more minutes, but what is, what is ketamine, and how's it historically been used, and I guess how's it being used today and in the future?
Sure. So ketamine was developed in the 1960s and as an anesthetic medication. And so you would think, well, an anesthetic medication is about as far from an antidepressant medication as you can get. But in the early days, it is a cousin of a drug called psilocybin. And psilocybin is an abused drug. Ketamine also, to some extent, an abused drug, but known as PCP or angel dust. But in the late 1950s, a psychiatrist gave a dose of PCP to healthy people as they were trying to understand its properties, and found that it had effects that were in some ways resembling the symptoms of schizophrenia, but only transiently. But people didn't know how these drugs work, and so they really abandoned the psychopharmacology of this whole class of drugs, the psilocybin, which eventually became illegal, and then ketamine, which remained used as an anesthetic medication. In other words, putting people to sleep for surgery and also to suppress the pain associated with surgery. And what happened with ketamine was that in the 1980s, in other words, 30 years after the testing of these medications started, it wasn't for 30 years that people figured out how these drugs worked in the brain. And that was about the time that I was beginning my career. And so when I joined the faculty and I was initially working in the area of schizophrenia, I discovered ketamine as a potentially useful tool to probe a chemical system in the brain. That chemical system of the brain is the main information highway of the brain. And you might call it the glutamate system because it uses glutamate as the main chemical messenger for communication. And up until that point, almost all of psychiatry research focused on chemicals that were only accounted for maybe a few percentage of the synapses of the brain, but have more familiar names like serotonin and norepinephrine or noradrenaline or dopamine. And when I started my research, I started focusing on glutamate, the main information highway, and used ketamine to probe that. And we decided to test the idea that the glutamate signaling was altered in depression. And in that process, that's how we discovered the rapid antidepressant effects of ketamine. That was about 1997, 96, 97. And the paper came out in 2000. And in 2019, almost 20 years later, then the FDA approved S-ketamine, which is a version of ketamine that is approved by the FDA for the treatment of treatment-resistant depression.
Reverend Perry, I can see that your synapses twirling, so jump in.
Well, I was wondering, John, whether or not Dr. Timothy Leary, during the time you were doing this study, he was really, there was really a revolution, it seems to me, with regard to these experimental drugs. And there was really a pushback on both sides.
Right.
I'm wondering, were you influenced at all by that period of time?
You know, it was certainly an exciting time to live through those late 60s. And, but I took the lesson of what happened to Timothy Leary and all of those people very seriously. So we all of America saw, the hippies and the Grateful Dead and use of LSD and other drugs, and linked to a kind of search for spirituality. But what was not really appreciated was that there had been the beginnings of rigorous, careful research with those medications like LSD and psilocybin as a treatment for depression. And when the Drug Enforcement Agency, I guess DEA, and the FDA clamped down on drugs like LSD and psilocybin because of the recreational use, they also shut down the testing of drugs like LSD and psilocybin for treatment. And so all of that work was almost completely shut down, certainly in the United States, from early 1970s up into the early 1990s, when for the first time people started to try to be able to test psilocybin and related drugs again in people. And what's interesting is that one of the, I would say, maybe unintended consequences of showing the antidepressant effects of ketamine, which has, as I mentioned, kind of it produces changes in perception and feelings of unreality, other things like that, was that other people started testing other drugs like psilocybin as treatments for depression to revisiting the literature from the 1960s and trying to do that work in a more rigorous way. So there was just a few days ago published in the New England Journal of Medicine a paper about psilocybin as having antidepressant effects. So what happened was, and it's something that I think my colleagues and I take to heart, is how careful and cautious we have to be in the testing of these drugs and the way in which they're administered, and how specific and rigorous we are in the research, so that we don't trigger a backlash. Because if addiction with problems or abuse problems with these drugs became too big of an issue, it would clearly have a negative effect on the possibility of getting access to ketamine or other treatments that might be developed. So I take that very seriously. It's both, in a way, an inspiration, this notion of consciousness expansion and spirituality, but also a cautionary tale about how easily that can trigger a negative pushback.
So is ketamine a drug that you would use like for the rest of your life? That's one question. As a kind of maintenance, so you never really get off of it, but it helps you. And then what about that, like you were talking about other drugs, like some people have said that about marijuana since the 70s, or about some of the other, like mushrooms and other drugs.
Yeah.
If a person is taking ketamine, and would there be a cautionary note about them taking any other drugs that dealt with that kind of?
Yeah. So, my view of all of these medications is that they're very different. They have very different impacts on people's lives when they're used in a therapeutic setting that's very controlled and very supported, than if they're used recreationally. The very same experience when people are around you helping to organize your thoughts and experiences, it can be very, very stressful, even traumatic, to have similar kinds of experiences when you're on your own and confused and don't know what's happening to you. I mean, people have profound changes in their sense of themselves and their relationship to the environment. Now, with ketamine, which is a very short-acting drug, those kinds of experiences only last about a half hour when administered typically. But some of the other drugs that are administered, like psilocybin, those states can last for 6 hours, and LSD, it can last 10 or 12 hours even from a single dose. And that's a really long time to be in an altered state of consciousness, particularly if you're finding it scary. So it's not surprising that when used recreationally, you hear a lot of stories about bad trips, and you hear about flashbacks. And flashbacks are, as you know, a symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder, and maybe for some people a sign that they had a really bad, scary experience on the drug. So, we really focus on trying to structure treatment in a very careful way. That being said, ketamine treatment is really different than almost any other treatment that you can think of in psychiatry. The goal of ketamine treatment is to give it as infrequently as possible, rather than as frequently as possible. So generally, when people start ketamine, they start getting it twice a week. Now, and that's because when a person gets their first dose of ketamine, the antidepressant typically lasts between 3 to 7 days. Even though the effects of the drug only last about an hour or hour and a half, the antidepressant effects come on after a few hours and then last for a few days. But so people will start twice a week. Then after several weeks, they'll go to once a week. and then maybe they'll go to every other week. And um, if they're in an ongoing treatment, let me just take a step back, which is to say that ketamine is pretty much only administered to people who are already in psychiatry treatment, have already been treated with different kinds of psychotherapy and different kind of medications and failed. So nobody's getting ketamine to start off with, almost nobody. And almost everybody's getting ketamine in the context of being in an ongoing treatment where things just haven't worked out as hoped. And so for some people, they'll get maybe 6 months of ketamine treatment, and then in the context of their ongoing other treatment, and then they find they don't need the ketamine anymore. Other people will find that they can't sustain the improvement in mood unless they get booster doses of ketamine. And they may get those booster doses every 3 weeks, once a month, a little more or a little less frequently. But the idea is to give as little ketamine over time as possible. And in that context, where people are getting very few doses of ketamine and spreading them out over time, the antidepressant effects seem to be sustained over long periods of time, and that's optimal. And what's interesting about ketamine is that if someone were to take ketamine every day, you would probably get tolerant to the effects of ketamine. And people who abuse ketamine and recreationally use ketamine and take ketamine every day in robust doses, they tend to be more likely to get depressed from that kind of recreational use of ketamine. So we're really using ketamine to ping the system, and we may get to this in the discussion about why pinging the glutamate system may help to recruit the brain's own capacity for resilience. Whereas everyday use of ketamine may not be that good for the brain.
I have just one question. I've seen people take Wellbutrin as a kind of ongoing kind of a treatment. So when I hear you talking about ketamine, I'm wondering, are these people more suicidal or more, or the depression is at such a level that you said it's not for everyone. So for the people that it is for, who are they? Yeah.
So Wellbutrin is related. Wellbutrin is related to the standard classes of antidepressants that you have to take every day. So we generally have 3 main classes of antidepressants. Antidepressants that target the serotonin system, those are called SSRIs, or serotonin reuptake inhibitors, because they raise the level of serotonin in the synapse, in other words, the communication between nerve cells. And those are drugs like Prozac, or sertraline, or Zoloft, Paxil. Then you have drugs like bupropion that affect more the norepinephrine system, like noradrenaline, and then you have drugs that affect serotonin and norepinephrine. Those are called SNRIs. That's like venlafaxine is called Effexor, and duloxetine, another SNRI. But with all of these kinds of antidepressant medications, you need to take them every day. And the reason you need to take them every day is twofold. One is that the antidepressant effects depend on sustaining the exposure of the brain to norepinephrine or serotonin. And if you, while you're taking, these are studies that were done at Yale in the 1980s and 1990s. If you temporarily lower the level of serotonin or norepinephrine in the body while you're taking one of these medications, you can temporarily cause a return of depression symptoms. So the ability of these medications to work depends on taking them every day and sustaining the exposure of the brain to these, chemical messengers. The other reason they have to be taken every day is because you're taking them every day, your brain becomes dependent in a way on them. So if you abruptly stop the medication, like a Prozac, like a Zoloft, then you can get withdrawal symptoms that are unpleasant, headaches, feelings of electric shock, or very extreme tiredness, or a return of depression. So if you're taking a medication like Wellbutrin, like Zoloft, like Effexor, and you've been taking it every day for a while, then you have to taper it down and not just stop all at once. Otherwise, you can get withdrawal symptoms.
Dr. John, when I was a student, some of my classmates at the Yale, when they got depressed, they would go to the Yale Center.
Yeah.
And I went to see one, and they'd given him Thorazine. And my God, he swole up, he froze up, and I kept thinking, why would anybody give anybody this drug? Are they still doing that with Thorazine?
Yeah, one of the things that you learn as a psychiatrist is both the art and the science of those medications. And with certain medications, it's not just the medication itself, but how you use it. So Thorazine, for example, is a medication that if you start at too much of a dose right away, that people are likely to get side effects. And particularly if you're treating young men and you start a high dose of Thorazine, then nowadays we almost always give another medication along with the Thorazine in order to prevent the emergence of the side effects that you're describing. So we can pretty well make Thorazine a much more tolerable medication now than it was back in the day. And also the ideas of treatment have evolved, and they've evolved as a result of brain imaging research, where we can actually measure in the brain the availability of the targets for a drug like Thorazine in the brain. The targets are called the dopamine D2 receptor. And so we've learned, we used to think, that the tendency in medicine has always been more is better. Like if one aspirin is good, then 2 aspirin is going to be better. It turns out with Thorazine, more is not always better. And that what we try to do is to block about 60 to 80% of the dopamine D2 receptors with Thorazine. Because when that happens, if you have schizophrenia, then the amount of dopamine stimulation of dopamine D2 receptors is about normal. In the old days, we used to go up to 100% blockade of the dopamine D2 receptors. And so we were producing side effects of dopamine deficiency in people out of a misguided notion about how these drugs worked and how they helped people. And so now we don't even try to give the doses that we did in the old days. And we are shooting for a lower target. And so that makes the medications better tolerated and safer. And it makes them makes people more willing to take drugs like that. Because who would want to take a medication that made you feel slowed down and stiff, or whatever the side effects that you saw? And that's proven really important, because some of these medications like Thorazine can sometimes be added on to a medication like Prozac or Zoloft when a person isn't responding. And a very common path that people follow in order to become eligible for ketamine is to first go on a medication like Zoloft or Paxil or Prozac. And if they don't respond very well, maybe they switch to a different one. Maybe they switch to the Wellbutrin, or maybe they switch to the effexor, switching from serotonin to something targeting norepinephrine. And if that doesn't work, then oftentimes something like Thorazine will be added. And if that doesn't work, where do you go next? That's where something like ketamine can come in. Because one of the things that used to happen, which we've learned was, unfortunate, was that patients and doctors together would kind of give up. In other words, people would say, I've been on Prozac. It didn't do anything for me. Medications aren't going to do anything for me. And so then they'd spend years depressed, not able to focus, not fully in their families, not, when people are depressed, they often lose hope. They lose connection to the spiritual drive that keeps them going that we were talking about earlier. That depression just saps that experience from people and makes it hard to be connected. And some of those people, all they needed was that next step in treatment. They would have responded to the addition of Thorazine. And nowadays we have ketamine or S-ketamine, which is the intranasal version, that can help many people who are struggling with depression, have been treated for depression, but still haven't gotten better. What
is that intranasal thing? Something you swipe the nose with, or you like a spray? Or?
Yeah, it's really very clever. Well, it's the kind of thing that we like in research when someone solves a problem in a creative way. So we give ketamine, the regular ketamine, intravenously because the body chews up ketamine very quickly. And so S-ketamine, when it was developed, they wondered, is there a way to get enough ketamine into the body without having to give enormous doses of ketamine orally? And what they figured out was that if they could get the ketamine into the sinus, then the nasal sinus is very good at absorbing compounds and avoiding the metabolism, the first round of metabolism in the body, so that they could give a relatively low amount of ketamine, give it through the nasal spray, and get high levels of ketamine into the brain needed to treat depression. And that's really important because ketamine works in a kind of a narrow dose range. Too little, it doesn't work. Too much, you get more side effects, but you don't necessarily get more benefit. So either through the intravenous infusion or through the nasal spray that was developed by Janssen Pharmaceuticals with S-ketamine, you can get good absorption.
We have about 13 minutes, so let's kind of brainstorm our things. There's so many questions I want to ask. Dr. Krystal, kind of piggybacking on Reverend Perry's comments about the various types of treatments. How does a person, what's the process? Does your primary care person recommend you've talked about some of the hurdles, and I'm sure some of my listeners are saying, why do I have to jump over these hurdles? Why can't I just go for the gold immediately with ketamine? So maybe kind of share a little bit about that.
Right. So let me address that first, because the temptation is to view something that works in this treatment-resistant context as just better, and we don't really know that ketamine is just better. And in fact, when we've looked at mild depression, ketamine does not appear to be particularly effective. So it's really distinctively effective when people have not responded to other kinds of antidepressant treatment. So then that means you have to kind of follow the path of depression treatment. It means getting connected. Oftentimes people are getting their first trial of ketamine from their family doctor, not ketamine, their first trial of an antidepressant. In other words, they go to their family doctor or their nurse practitioner and they say, I've been feeling really down. I can't sleep. I can't eat. I've got no appetite. I don't feel like doing anything. And the doctor or the nurse will start them on something like Prozac. and they're on it for a month or so, and they haven't gotten better. They're not really experiencing any change. Often at that point, it's really helpful to either get consultation from a psychiatrist or to get referred to a psychiatrist. And because it's really the psychiatrists that are most comfortable combining medications, switching medications. That's our bread and butter. That's what we do every day. And so getting connected to a psychiatrist at that point, whether it's in a community clinic or a private psychiatrist, whoever, and then going that next step or two, where you try a new antidepressant or something is added to your antidepressant. The psychiatrists also are better connected to the programs for treatment-resistant symptoms of depression. So for example, there is a program at Yale New Haven Hospital. It's called the Interventional Psychiatry Program. And it's one of the busiest programs that we have. In the Interventional Psychiatry Program offers the treatments for patients who don't respond that well to other antidepressant medications. So they administer ketamine and esketamine, and they administer electroconvulsive therapy, in other words, the brain stimulation treatment. And they also offer something called transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is stimulating the brain with the magnet rather than electricity. And this clinic is very busy and very oversubscribed, but the way that they work is people have to be in an ongoing treatment that's not working out, and then involvement in the interventional psychiatry program is added to their ongoing treatment. But the interventional psychiatry service at Yale New Haven accepts referrals from all practitioners, and sometimes it's hard to keep up with the wait list, either for the ketamine or esketamine treatment or for the brain stimulation treatments, but they do the best they can. I think one of the problems that we have in America is that there aren't clinics like the interventional psychiatry service in all cities. In interventional psychiatry, our program will treat people who have insurance, people who have Medicaid, Medicare, but oftentimes, because of the way that relatively poor way that Medicare and Medicaid reimburse treatment, a lot of programs that were set up to provide ketamine and esketamine treatment around the country have not taken patients with Medicare and Medicaid. And that's a huge problem and a real issue for how we develop treatments in this country. Sometimes the people who need them the most have trouble getting access to them. And that's something I think we all need to work together to change.
Reverend Perry.
I think that was my question. How do poor people and marginalized people and people who just don't have the income level to get this treatment? I think that's sad. I'm glad to hear about this interventional psychiatric program that's in New Haven, and I guess that's one way we can get the word out to people. See, here's the other thing, John. It just seems to me, if I once took a young lady who was hooked on drugs. We tried everything to get her to stop. I took her to see a psychiatrist. This was in White Plains, New York, many years ago. The cost was $400 an hour. After $1,200, the doctor said to her, "I don't think you want to live. So you're wasting my time because I tell you what to do. You're not doing it. So now I'm at $1,200. And, it's just like, but only if I couldn't afford $1,200, if I couldn't afford $400, the emergency room could not really deal with the issue because it's something that takes time and a probing of the mind and an understanding. So, I think this is really a problem for all of us. I don't know if there is a solution to it. I don't know if a major school like Yale might be able to set up a kind of doorway by which individuals could somehow get the treatment that's necessary, you know, and because the
Right.
suicide rate, the death rate, just the human bondage that's out there that could be maybe saved is lost.
Yeah. Well, there's so much in what you said, Reverend Perry, and you know, that I'd like to unpack some of it. One is that people need to know that there are many doors in the New Haven area to get access to treatment. There's there's the Cornell Scott Hill Health Center psychiatry clinic. There's the Connecticut Mental Health Center, which is takes you know, anyone, and obviously veterans have access to the VA Connecticut healthcare system, and the VA has its own program for ketamine and esketamine. So veterans can get access to ketamine through the VA hospital in West Haven, and obviously Yale New Haven. So that's really important for people to know that there are lots of doors and lots of ways that they can get connected. The second thing is that it's best to get help early. In other words, when you feel the depression coming on and you think you need help, that's the time to get connected. Find a counselor, find a therapist, find a clinic, find somebody to get connected and get support you need early in the course, so that you don't have to be in an extreme situation where getting help is a life and death matter, and where you need to come to the emergency room. Because the emergency room is a place, it's a gateway, as you point out, the emergency room is a gateway to getting urgent help. Like if you need to come into the hospital, if you need to get a referral somewhere, of course, you know, that's, the emergency room is great, but it's so much better and so much less stressful if people can find paths that get them to the clinics before they need to go to the emergency room. Because nobody likes to go to emergency room. There's flashing lights and crowded people and people rushing about. It's not conducive to building the kind of relationships that you're talking about. The third thing you said, which is extremely important, and which I can't stress enough, which is that the system of mental health care in the United States is broken, and that Medicare, Medicaid reimburse at such a low level that it's really hard oftentimes for people to find in the community a clinician who will see them with Medicare and Medicaid, but it's not hard to find an internist. It's not hard to find a surgeon when you need one. It's hard to find a therapist or a psychiatrist who will treat you, because it's reimbursed. Treatment is reimbursed at such a lower level that too many mental health practitioners go into the private space. It's a national problem. It's one we need to figure out how we're going to solve, it's just really unfortunate.
Gentlemen, we have about 2 more minutes, and I just wanted to jump in, Dr. Krystal, about it. If the show ended and if I didn't ask a question about research and participation in clinical trials, I would have regret and have to go into a psychiatric clinic tomorrow, because I would be going crazy. But just as we conclude, and we have about 90 seconds, talk to us about the research and the importance of research and participation in clinical trials.
Yeah. Well, first, every time I come on the show, I think we begin the conversation for another visit. So
indeed, There's a method to our madness.
The second thing I would say is that none of what I've talked about today, none of the antidepressant medications, we wouldn't have ketamine. All of this research is really a result of the incredible generosity of people who have volunteered to participate in research and who have helped together to generate this knowledge that we hope is now circling back and feeding back and providing improvement. You know, some of this research was very basic. It took years and years for this work to be really clinically applicable. And so people participating in brain scans and people participating in genetic studies and all of that bring us to the point where we have the new treatments. So I encourage and am grateful for people who wish to join this kind of research effort by volunteering.
And the best way for folks to participate and jump into this clinical research stream, swimming in their way toward health?
Yeah. So if people want to get referred to research, I'm happy to, they can call my office or send me an email. My email address is john.krystal, Krystal, at Yale, YALE.edu. And I will help you get connected to people who are doing research on the topic of interest.
Excellent. Gentlemen, thank you so much. Thank you so much. So as you say, as Reverend Perry would say, until then, until the next time, Dr. Christian.
As I got another rhyme, another rhythm for y'all to listen. I'm never quitting on my mission. I'ma roll with what I'm giving. Got some ambition, this new edition, filling positions. Looking at the void in myself and feeling what's missing. Better watch the way you going. Better go in the right direction. In the moment you stressing, but you gon' be counting blessings. And I know that for certain. Keep on working, open curtains. Haters swerving, cause they ain't ready for your final version. Whoa. I'm never gonna give up.